Okinawa, May 1945. The battle had burned for weeks, the air thick with salt, cordite, and rain. At dawn, the ridge still smoked. Empty helmets lay where men had fallen. Through the drifting mist, a small group of Japanese officers appeared, uniforms torn, faces pale, their white flag trembling in the wind. American Marines held their rifles low, fingers resting on triggers but eyes steady. One of them, mud-caked, sunburnt, reached into his pouch and pulled out a cigarette pack. Another twisted the lid off a dented thermos and poured steaming coffee into a tin cup. The aroma cut through the smell of death. The Japanese officers froze. Coffee? Cigarettes? From the enemy? They had been told Americans would torture them, that surrender meant humiliation worse than death. Yet here they stood, shivering, as their captors offered them warmth instead of pain. For the first time, they looked into American eyes and saw something completely foreign to their world: mercy. The steam rose between them like a fragile truce, in a war built on fire. By the time those officers walked down that smoking ridge in Okinawa, the Pacific War had already become a struggle beyond comprehension. It was 1944 moving into 1945, the Empire of Japan collapsing under the relentless pressure of an enemy whose industrial reach seemed limitless. From the jungles of New Guinea to the volcanic rocks of Iwo Jima, the Imperial Japanese Army had learned the true weight of modern war. Each island was a fortress, each hill a death trap, and yet orders from Tokyo remained unchanged. Fight to the last man. Die with honor. Never surrender. This code, Bushido, had been drilled into every soldier, from the youngest private to the highest officer. It was more than discipline, it was identity. The shame of capture did not end with one's own life. It extended to one's family, ancestors, and even one's regiment. In Japanese military culture, the prisoner was no longer a soldier, he was a ghost. Because of this, surrenders in the early years of the Pacific War were almost non-existent. To Americans, that made the Japanese enemy terrifyingly alien. On the other side stood a military power built on procedure and pragmatism. The United States, adhering to the 1929 Geneva Convention, had established detailed standard operating procedures for handling prisoners of war. Even in the chaos of island combat, U.S. manuals instructed frontline troops: disarm, search, safeguard, and administer aid. The reasoning was both moral and practical. Wounded men left untreated could still be dangerous, and prisoners treated fairly could yield valuable intelligence. But to a Japanese soldier conditioned to expect death, such words sounded like fiction. In the earliest encounters, that misunderstanding turned fatal. Many Japanese pretended to surrender, only to detonate grenades or attack medics, reinforcing American suspicion. Others, too fearful to approach, starved or bled out in caves rather than face capture. As the war dragged on, however, certain officers and units began to sense the futility of blind obedience. In places like Tarawa, Tinian, and later Leyte, small groups laid down their arms, not out of cowardice, but exhaustion. What they found on the other side of the line would upend a lifetime of propaganda. Instead of mockery, they found order. Instead of cruelty, they found routine. Field kitchens, water drums, medics, and, strangely, cigarettes. For the Americans, these gestures weren't meant as sentiment. A cigarette was simply something every soldier carried, a symbol of normalcy in a world gone insane. Yet, to those who had been told that Americans were barbarians, that small act cracked open the walls of fear. The first documented reports from these encounters began filtering back to intelligence officers. Captured Japanese were often dazed, polite, and deeply confused. They would bow to their guards. They would whisper, "Why no kill?" The answer came not in words, but in steaming cups of coffee and bandaged wounds. It was here, in these improvised frontline stockades and muddy collection points, that two vastly different worlds met. One bound by honor unto death, the other by rules meant to outlive war itself. And as both sides learned, that difference would shape the war's moral frontier. By mid-1944, the Pacific had turned into an American ocean. Carrier groups ranged from the Marshalls to the Marianas, their decks bristling with aircraft, their holds filled with fuel, rations, and millions of tiny comforts. cigarettes, chocolate, instant coffee. Behind every Marine and GI advancing through jungle or coral stood a logistics machine of staggering scale. It could deliver destruction and mercy in equal measure. As American forces captured island after island, the number of Japanese prisoners began to rise, not in vast columns, as in Europe, but in small, frightened clusters. Men who had chosen survival over suicide. By the time of Saipan in July 1944, hundreds were being processed. Military police established temporary holding areas, guarded but humane. Canteens were set up. Water buckets and first aid tents followed. Many of the prisoners arrived half-starved, covered in sores, trembling from dehydration. When medics handed them coffee or a cigarette, it was not strategy, it was habit. Every American ration kit contained them. To offer one was second nature, yet word of those small gestures did not fade. Among Japanese soldiers still in the field, whispers spread. The Americans. They give water. They give food. It was an idea almost too dangerous to believe. In Tokyo, propaganda agencies condemned such stories as lies meant to weaken morale. But in the caves of Iwo Jima or the hills of Luzon, that rumor carried weight. It suggested that surrender did not always end in horror, that one might live to see another sunrise. The U.S. military took notice too. By late 1944, intelligence officers began using these testimonies as tools of psychological warfare. Leaflets were airdropped over Japanese positions, written in formal kanji, guaranteeing humane treatment. You will receive food, water, and medical care. You will not be harmed. Some even depicted a Japanese soldier being offered coffee by an American guard, a scene unimaginable a year earlier. Alongside leaflets came loudspeaker appeals broadcast in Japanese. Lay down your arms. You will be treated well. These efforts were not purely moral. They were tactical. Every man who surrendered was one less to kill, one more to interrogate. But the implementation of humane policy required discipline. Commanders had to ensure that kindness did not become weakness, that compassion did not endanger their troops. Regulations were explicit. Guards must remain armed. No fraternization. Prisoners were to be searched and recorded. Still, within those limits, humanity thrived in small forms. A blanket, a meal, a smoke. The Red Cross and the War Department coordinated shipments of supplies to established camps in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. Prisoners were catalogued, given serial numbers, and allowed correspondence through monitored mail. Medical officers treated tropical diseases, malnutrition, and wounds neglected for weeks. Reports described many captives as cooperative and surprisingly disciplined, often saluting their American captors in traditional fashion. From these encounters, something larger emerged, a contrast that illuminated the cultural divide of the entire war. Where Japan taught death as duty, America enforced life as law. In that gap between ideologies, the sight of a cigarette or a cup of coffee became far more than a courtesy. It became a challenge to belief, proof that even amid fire and ruin, decency could still survive. The human angle in the moments after capture, silence often said more than words. Japanese officers would sit rigidly, hands folded, eyes lowered. The Americans, unsure whether to treat them as enemies or patients, defaulted to what they knew. Routine. A medic cleaned wounds. A Marine poured black coffee into canteen cups. Someone struck a match and held it out, the flame trembling in the wind. The prisoners hesitated. Accepting a cigarette from the enemy was almost unthinkable, yet instinct, not ideology, took over. They inhaled. The smoke burned their throats but steadied their nerves. The warmth of the coffee seemed unreal after days of thirst. For many, it was their first taste of peace since the war began. Witness accounts describe how confusion slowly turned into quiet gratitude. One Japanese lieutenant later recalled thinking, "These men treat even their enemies like soldiers." Another wrote that the coffee smelled of America, of machines, order, and strange kindness. For the Americans, it was nothing extraordinary. To them, decency was discipline, an extension of command. But for the Japanese, raised on tales of Allied brutality, the simple act of being treated as human dismantled years of indoctrination. It didn't end the war, but it changed how they understood it. The scene repeated itself countless times across the Pacific. The exchange of a cigarette, two hands trembling for different reasons, became a silent confession that both sides were human after all. The tactical angle to U.S. commanders, humane treatment wasn't just moral, it was strategic. An enemy who believed capture meant survival was an enemy who might surrender. On islands where every cave could hide a suicide charge, that mattered. Interrogation units soon realized that respect yielded better intelligence than fear. A well-treated officer might talk freely, sharing maps or orders simply because he was alive to do so. Reports from the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, noted how captured Japanese, once convinced of their safety, provided accurate details on logistics and morale within their units. Frontline Marines and soldiers quickly learned that keeping a prisoner calm was a matter of safety. Panic could lead to violence. Composure came through trust. A cigarette, a blanket, or a sip of coffee were not luxuries. They were tools of control. Officers ordered them to be used sparingly, but effectively. There was another tactical layer, too. The humane image of the U.S. soldier directly contradicted Japanese propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. Every act of mercy weakened that narrative, subtly eroding the fanaticism that sustained resistance. A surrendered officer who later spoke of being fed and treated well could do more damage to enemy morale than 1,000 bullets. In the end, small acts of kindness became part of a larger psychological operation, not born from cynicism, but from the realization that humanity itself could be a weapon. 3. The technological, logistical angle behind every steaming cup and glowing cigarette was an empire of supply. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps moved mountains of material across oceans: fuel, rations, medical kits, tobacco, even sugar. Each soldier's K-ration included soluble coffee packets and 4 cigarettes. It was part of morale, but it also reflected abundance. American coffee, strong and bitter, contrasted sharply with the scarcity inside the Japanese ranks. By 1944, Japan's supply lines were strangled. Soldiers survived on rice mixed with barley or roots. Tobacco, once a common ration, had become a rare luxury. To receive these things from one's enemy was to confront the vast economic gap between the two nations. That, too, had psychological weight. The gesture of giving coffee or cigarettes wasn't just humane. It demonstrated power without cruelty. It showed that America could afford mercy because it had already won the war of supply. Even the logistics of kindness were industrial. For the Americans, this abundance created normalcy in a world of chaos. For the Japanese, it revealed how completely their empire had been outmatched, not just in weaponry, but in the simple comforts of life. The smell of roasted coffee beans carried more than caffeine. It carried the quiet message that civilization, as they knew it, had shifted forever. The leadership policy angle. At higher command levels, humane treatment of prisoners was not optional. It was law. The United States had long upheld the Geneva Convention standards for the treatment of POWs. Officers were drilled to understand that the way they treated captives reflected the discipline of the entire force. Field commanders in the Pacific were given clear orders: no unnecessary violence, no humiliation, and no fraternization. A captured enemy was to be processed, questioned, and safeguarded. This wasn't just about morality, it was about control. An army that could restrain its rage, even after suffering atrocities, was an army that could win wars and still hold its moral ground. General Douglas MacArthur himself emphasized the civilized character of Allied warfare. He understood that the moral image of the U.S. military would influence both post-war politics and ongoing propaganda battle. In memos circulated through Pacific commands, officers were reminded that discipline under stress is the truest measure of a soldier. Leadership recognized something profound, that the treatment of prisoners would be remembered long after victory. It was part of shaping America's image, not just as a victor, but as a nation of law. At the same time, discipline had to prevent sympathy from turning into risk. Guards were trained never to underestimate their captives. Every cigarette offered was balanced by a watchful rifle. Kindness was not weakness, it was controlled power. In this balance, American leadership found its own form of strength, the ability to destroy without hatred and to show mercy without fear. 5. The enemy POV code angle. For the captured Japanese officers, the internal conflict was unbearable. They had spent their entire careers believing that capture was a disgrace worse than death. To live as a prisoner meant living as a man already dead in the eyes of one's nation. Some refused to speak. Some wept in silence. Others clung to ritual politeness, bowing to their captors and using formal language, as though dignity could be preserved through manners. They found themselves haunted by the contradiction. Their enemies offered comfort, while their homeland had condemned them to shame. One captured naval officer, interviewed months later, described the first time he tasted American coffee. He said it was bitter and warm, like defeat. He accepted it with both hands, bowing slightly, unable to meet the Marine's eyes. That simple act forced him to confront everything he had been taught about honor. The cigarette, too, carried symbolism. In Japanese culture, to share smoke was an act of camaraderie. To accept one from the enemy blurred the line between loyalty and survival. And yet, faced with exhaustion, hunger, and fear, many took it, not out of betrayal, but as proof that the world still contained fragments of humanity. Through those exchanges, officers began to see that the Americans were not the monsters their propaganda had described. They were efficient, confident, even courteous. This realization broke something deeper than military pride. It dismantled the myth of invincibility that had sustained Japan's war effort for years. 6. The moral angle war tests not just weapons, but values. On the battlefields of the Pacific, cruelty was common, vengeance was easy, and compassion was dangerous. Yet amid the blood and chaos, acts of restraint became a form of quiet rebellion against the brutality of total war. When a Marine handed a cigarette to a defeated enemy, he wasn't thinking of philosophy, but history would. In that instant, he reaffirmed the difference between annihilation and civilization, between victory through fear and victory through principle. American soldiers had seen their comrades tortured, mutilated, and killed, yet many still chose to follow the code, not because their enemies deserved mercy, but because they themselves refused to become monsters. The coffee, the cigarette, the bandage, each was a small stand against the dehumanization that war demanded. For the Japanese, those gestures planted quiet seeds. Many survivors would later recall them as moments when they began to question the propaganda of their own regime. For the Americans, they became proof that moral strength could exist even amid destruction. It was through these small human choices that the war's larger moral contrast became clear, and its legacy began to take shape. The Pacific still burned, but in the smoke rose something unexpected, the faint aroma of decency. Okinawa, late May 1945. The island was collapsing into ruin. American artillery thundered day and night, shattering caves, bunkers, and the last pockets of Japanese resistance. The 32nd Army, once 100,000 strong, was being erased by fire and steel. For the Japanese defenders, surrender remained unthinkable. Yet, for a few, survival began to outweigh ideology. On the slopes near Shuri Castle, a white flag appeared through the smoke. 6 men emerged, their movements slow, mechanical. They were officers, their uniforms filthy, insignia still pinned to tattered collars. Behind them, American Marines of the 6th Division froze, weapons raised, but eyes cautious. The lead officer stopped a few yards away, bowing stiffly before collapsing to his knees. For several seconds, no one spoke. Only the sound of rain hitting burned earth. Then, a Marine sergeant, his face blackened by powder, broke the silence. He signaled for his men to hold fire, then gestured toward a medic. The medic approached, rifle slung across his shoulder, and set down a canteen. Another Marine pulled a thermos from his pack. Lukewarm coffee, made hours earlier on a field stove. He poured it into a metal cup and slid it across the mud. The Japanese officer looked at it as though it were a weapon. Steam curled into the humid air. After a long pause, he reached forward, both hands trembling, and lifted the cup to his lips. The first sip came with visible hesitation, then relief. His eyes flickered upward, briefly meeting the Marine. From another pouch came a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. The sergeant tapped one out, held it toward the officer, and struck a match. The flame caught. Smoke rose between them like a fragile thread. To the Marines, it was a brief moment of calm amid exhaustion. To the Japanese, it was a shattering of everything they had believed. They had been told that surrender meant torture, that Americans would cut them open, laugh at their weakness. Instead, they were offered warmth, water, and a cigarette. Nearby, a field photographer snapped a picture, a spontaneous act that would later circulate through intelligence channels as a symbol of the changing tide. The image showed two enemies, bound by a single ritual, one lighting, the other inhaling. Within hours, more prisoners began to emerge from the caves. Word spread fast through the shattered ridges that the Americans were treating captives with respect. Some came out limping, some carried the wounded. For every handful that surrendered, dozens still chose death, grenades, self-inflicted gunshots, ritual suicide. But the balance had begun to shift. For the first time in the Pacific War, surrender no longer meant certain death. It meant an uncertain mercy. And for men who had lived in a code that despised weakness, even that was enough to create chaos in their conviction. When night fell, the Marines built a small fire under a torn camouflage sheet. The prisoners sat a few feet away, guarded yet unharmed, cups of coffee cradled in their hands. Around them, Okinawa burned. The horizon glowed red with artillery fire. And yet, amid that inferno, something extraordinary had taken root, an understanding neither side could fully name. The next morning, more white flags appeared across the ridge. Surrender, once unthinkable, had become contagious, not because of leaflet, not because of propaganda, but because of what those first men had tasted in the mud, humanity. By the following afternoon, American patrols across the Shuri line were stunned by what they saw. Dozens of Japanese soldiers emerging from the ruin, waving torn cloths of surrender. Not entire companies, but small groups, a handful here, a dozen there, hesitant, frightened, and half-starved. Each had heard the same rumor. The Americans do not kill prisoners. Among the first to arrive were several officers from an artillery battery that had been trapped for days. Their faces were hollow, their uniforms hanging loose from hunger. They had heard the whispers through captured radio fragments and dying comrades that those who surrendered were given water, food, and even cigarettes. For men raised to believe surrender was spiritual annihilation, this was not hope, but confusion made real. At a temporary processing point near Yonabaru, the scene repeated itself over and over. The prisoners were lined up, searched, and seated on the ground. They expected mockery or punishment, but instead, they were met with routine efficiency. A corporal checked their pockets for blades. Another marked down names and units. Then, as before, came the gesture. Water, coffee, cigarettes. Intelligence officers watched closely. They noticed how quickly tension faded once prisoners understood they were safe. Within hours, they began talking. Maps were drawn in the dirt. Bunker locations revealed. The American command recognized what compassion could accomplish faster than threats ever could. In one case, a captured staff officer voluntarily sketched his unit's last defensive line. When asked why, he replied through an interpreter, "You gave me drink." To the intelligence teams, that simple sentence summarized months of psychological warfare. Word of these surrenders spread beyond Okinawa. Intercepted Japanese messages recorded confusion and disbelief. Field commanders, unable to explain the growing wave of surrender, reported enemy trickery. But for those still trapped in caves, the truth was plain. Surrender no longer meant dishonor. It meant life. For American troops, this shift carried its own emotional charge. Many had lost friends to fanatical, last stands or suicide charges. To now see enemy soldiers laying down their weapons peacefully felt both strange and relieving. They were no longer ghosts in the jungle. They were men, beaten and afraid, just like anyone else. Photographers and correspondents who arrived later captured these fragile encounters. In one widely distributed photo, a U.S. Marine bends to light a cigarette. For a kneeling Japanese officer, the contrast between the victor's relaxed expression and the captive's solemn bow became emblematic of something larger than victory: restraint. Military historians would later note that, in the closing months of the Pacific War, the humane treatment of Japanese POWs helped accelerate the psychological collapse of the imperial forces. Every act of mercy undercut the government's narrative of Western barbarity. Each cup of coffee became a quiet propaganda. Victory stronger than any leaflet. When the Battle of Okinawa ended in June 1945, the statistics told one story: over 100,000 Japanese dead, nearly 7,000 taken prisoner. But the images told another. Men once sworn to die had discovered that mercy existed on the other side of fire. And for those who survived, the memory of that first smoke, that first sip of coffee, would remain etched deeper than the battle itself. It was the moment they realized that their empire's code of death had met something it could not defeat: humanity. The war was not yet over. Hiroshima and Nagasaki still waited on the horizon. But on that broken ridge in Okinawa, the war's moral tide had already turned. When the guns finally fell silent over Okinawa, the island was more graveyard than battlefield. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers lay buried beneath collapsed tunnels and scorched hillsides. The Americans, too, had paid a terrible price. Yet amid the devastation, small camps of Japanese prisoners began to emerge across the island. Neat rows of tents, barbed wire, medical stations, and watchtowers built with American efficiency. By June 1945, Okinawa held thousands of captured Japanese soldiers and civilians, all stunned to still be alive. They were given food, deloused, and examined by medical corpsmen. Field kitchens operated around the clock, serving soup, rice, and coffee. The same coffee that had once symbolized the enemy's strange kindness now became part of the daily routine of captivity. For many prisoners, it was their first time tasting it regularly, a ritual that slowly replaced the bitterness of defeat with quiet survival. Reports from U.S. military intelligence described the captives as cooperative, disciplined, and orderly. Many saluted their guards. Others volunteered to help bury the dead or assist medics in treating wounded Americans. The war had not erased their sense of honor. It had merely reshaped it. To the Americans, the humane treatment of these men was not sentimentalism, it was a moral stance sharpened by contrast. News had already spread of Japanese atrocities in China, the Philippines, and on captured Allied POWs. Yet instead of reciprocating cruelty, U.S. leadership enforced restraint. Prisoners were photographed, fingerprinted, and catalogued with bureaucratic precision. Each received an identification number, clean clothing, and 3 meals a day. These camps became miniature studies in the psychology of defeated warriors. American officers noted how Japanese captives struggled to reconcile the reality before them. They expected scorn. They found fairness. They expected vengeance. They found order. That dissonance broke the mythology that their empire had built, the belief that the enemy was subhuman. In the weeks that followed, the Red Cross began coordinating transfers to larger camps in Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii. There, conditions were carefully monitored. Prisoners were allowed limited correspondence, access to reading material, and even simple work duties. Each morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast, often rice mixed with canned vegetables, bread, or coffee. Letters written after the war by former captives revealed their astonishment at this treatment. One officer remembered, "The Americans treated us as men, not beasts. It was difficult to understand, yet comforting to the heart." Another wrote of learning English from guards who shared cigarettes during long night shifts. For both sides, the monotony of camp life blurred the boundaries of hatred. But these interactions were not without purpose. For American intelligence, every conversation was an opportunity, a way to map Japan's military mindset, morale, and supply routes. Humanity had become an instrument of strategy, and kindness, in its quiet efficiency, proved far more powerful than coercion. The war in the Pacific was nearing its end, but the echoes of Okinawa, of coffee cups and cigarettes between enemies were already reshaping what surrender meant. After Okinawa, the United States faced a vast moral and logistical challenge: the care of tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners scattered across the Pacific. By the time Japan formally surrendered in August 1945, the Allied command had processed nearly 100,000 POWs. Each camp became a living record of a war that had turned from fire to reflection. In Guam and Hawaii, fenced compounds spread across green hills. There were workshops, kitchens, and small chapels built from scrap wood. The prisoners worked in agriculture, carpentry, and maintenance under strict supervision, but also with clear boundaries of respect. Every camp was expected to meet the Geneva Convention's minimum standards, not merely out of compliance, but conviction. Officers from the War Department and Red Cross made regular inspections. Reports described discipline, hygiene, and surprisingly, high morale. Most prisoners gained weight, their health improving rapidly after months of starvation. For many, the morning ritual was the same: roll call, breakfast, and the scent of hot coffee wafting from mess tents. What had once been the enemy's symbol of alien modernity now became a daily comfort, proof that captivity could be more humane than command. Many Japanese officers began to question not just the war, but the ideology that had driven it. Their captors had done something their empire never prepared them for. They treated them as equals in defeat. Letters smuggled home years later reveal a kind of quiet awe. One wrote, "I learned that mercy is stronger than death." Another confessed that the taste of American coffee reminded him of what civilization should feel like. As peace settled, these same men were eventually repatriated. When they disembarked in Japan, they carried memories their government had not anticipated. Some spoke of fair treatment. Others shared stories of American guards who offered cigarettes and talked about families back home. These recollections circulated quietly among veterans, small truths that contradicted years of propaganda. They challenged the wartime belief that surrender was shameful, instead suggesting that dignity could survive even in defeat. Historians would later trace how these experiences subtly influenced Japan's post-war transformation. Many former officers who had been prisoners later entered government, business, or academia. They carried with them an understanding of the West not built on fear, but on first-hand experience of restraint and order. For them, the cigarette and coffee cup had become symbols of a civilization that valued life over ideology. In 1949, when the new Geneva Conventions were signed, the lessons of the Pacific were deeply embedded in their language. The humane treatment of prisoners was no longer viewed as charity, but as the core of international law. The small acts of decency that occurred in the mud of Okinawa had helped shape a global standard for how nations would treat the defeated. The war had begun with firebombs and fanaticism. It ended, in part, with compassion, fragile, imperfect, but undeniably human. And for the Japanese officers who once trembled at the offer of coffee, that humanity would remain the most unforgettable taste of all. When the Pacific fell silent, it wasn't only the roar of guns that faded, it was the certainty that hatred alone could define victory. In the quiet that followed, the world was left to measure itself not by how fiercely it had fought, but by how humanly it had ended the fight. For the men who lived those moments, memory distilled itself into the smallest of images: a tin cup of steaming coffee, a shared cigarette, the sound of rain on canvas. Each gesture stood against the tide of destruction that had swept across oceans. Each reminded both captor and captive that even in total war, humanity could flicker like an ember refusing to die. To the Japanese officers who once bowed under a code of death before dishonor, those acts of mercy were not simply kindness, they were revelation. They learned that strength did not always shout. Sometimes it poured quietly into a cup, passed from one hand to another. To the Americans, these gestures confirmed that victory meant more than surviving. It meant remaining civilized when everything around them demanded savagery. In every war, brutality is easy, restraint is hard. It demands clarity, discipline, and the courage to see the enemy as human even when rage says otherwise. On Okinawa and across the Pacific, That courage was found, not in speeches or treaties, but in moments so small they nearly vanished from the record. Yet those moments mattered. They defined the moral boundary of the modern age, where power without conscience was no longer enough. The coffee, the cigarette, the offered match, they became emblems of a truth stronger than propaganda, that mercy, when chosen deliberately, is a weapon all its own. History often remembers the bombs and the battles, but sometimes it's the quiet acts between them that reveal what kind of world survived. The steam that once rose from those cups has long since vanished, but the idea it carried, that humanity can outlast war, still lingers, invisible, in the air of every peace that followed.